Hey guys, tonight we're exploring a story that everyone in history should know. The story is How Americans Survived Brutal Frontier Winters. You get comfortable. Take a moment, like the video, and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. How Americans Survived Brutal Frontier Winters. Imagine a winter morning on the American frontier. Long before weather forecasts appeared on a phone, long before roads were cleared by machines, and long before a warm house could be reached with a quick drive through the snow. The night has been quiet. Outside, the land is covered in a pale layer of snow. The trees stand dark against the early light, and the cold has settled into every corner of the landscape. A thin curl of smoke rises from a chimney, almost disappearing into the gray sky. Inside a small frontier home, however, the day has already begun. Someone has stirred the ashes in the fireplace. A few pieces of wood catch, and slowly a warmer glow appears. The room is still cold, but the sharpest edge of the night is beginning to fade. There is no central heating. There is no electric light. There is no supermarket waiting at the end of a road. If the family is going to remain warm, fed, and safe through the winter, nearly everything they need has already been prepared. That preparation was the real secret of surviving a frontier winter. For many settlers in 18th and 19th century North America, winter was not simply a season to endure. It was a problem that had to be solved months before the first serious snow arrived. People learned to read the land, to understand local weather, to store food, protect animals, preserve clothing, gather fuel, and choose shelter carefully. Some methods were brought from Europe. Others were learned from indigenous peoples who had lived for generations in the same environments. And many were developed through years of ordinary experience, when one family watched what worked for another and remembered what had failed the previous winter. The frontier was never one single place. It stretched across forests, prairies, mountains, river valleys, and northern plains. A family living near the Great Lakes faced different problems from one living in the Appalachian Mountains. A settler on the Great Plains experienced winter differently from someone living in a wooded New England valley. Yet the basic challenge remained familiar. Cold had to be managed. Food had to last. Travel had to be limited. And the home had to become a small world, capable of supporting life when the outside world became difficult to cross. As the morning slowly arrives, the first task is often the fire. Firewood was not merely useful, it was a form of stored energy. A household that entered winter without enough fuel could find itself in serious danger. Wood had to be cut, split, and stacked, while the weather still allowed comfortable work. This could be exhausting. Trees had to be felled by hand. Logs were cut with axes or saws, then split into pieces that could fit into the fireplace or stove. A large wood pile outside the house might look ordinary, but it represented many hours of work. It was also a reminder of something frontier families understood very well. The coldest day of winter was not the right time to discover that the wood was running out. So families often prepared their fuel during the warmer months. In forested regions, this was especially important. Wood could be gathered from the surrounding land, although the amount available and the rights to use it depended on the place and period. In some areas, timber was abundant. In others, especially on the open plains, suitable fuel could be much harder to find. On the Great Plains, some settlers used dried animal dung as fuel when wood was scarce. Buffalo chips, as dried bison dung was commonly called, could be collected from the ground and burned. It was not glamorous. But frontier survival rarely depended on glamour. It depended on whatever the landscape could provide. A family could not simply wish for a forest where there was none. They had to adapt to the environment around them. That same principle shaped the houses people built. The familiar image of a log cabin is not entirely imaginary, although real frontier homes varied greatly in design and quality. Logs were useful because they were available in many wooded regions and could be assembled without the need for a large supply of milled lumber. The walls were usually not simply left as rows of logs. Gaps between the logs had to be sealed. People used mixtures of mud, clay, lime, moss, or other locally available materials, depending on region and period. This process, often called chinking, helped reduce drafts. A tiny opening might seem harmless in autumn. In winter, it could become a constant stream of cold air. The roof mattered too. A poorly constructed roof could allow snow and rain to enter, while a weak structure could suffer under heavy accumulation. Windows presented another difficulty. Glass was available in many settlements, but it was expensive in earlier periods and not always easy to replace. Frontier homes could therefore have relatively small windows, and some temporary or poorer structures used simpler coverings. The purpose was not to create a bright, spacious interior. It was to create a shelter that could hold warmth. Picture yourself stepping inside one of these homes after standing outside in a winter wind. The difference could be immediate. Your hands are cold. Your face feels tight from the air. Your clothing may carry the smell of snow and smoke. Then you approach the fire. Slowly, feeling begins to return to your fingers. The room is still far from what we would call comfortable today, but the walls block the wind. The fire provides heat, and the people inside are protected from the worst of the weather. That distinction mattered. Frontier survival did not mean creating modern comfort. It meant reducing danger. And sometimes the most important protection was something almost invisible, a layer of air. Air trapped inside clothing, blankets, walls, and bedding could slow the loss of body heat. People used wool, fur, leather, quilts, and layered garments according to what was available and affordable. Wool was especially useful because it retained insulating properties even when damp. Fur could provide excellent protection against cold, and animal skins were widely used in frontier life for clothing, bedding, and other purposes. But clothing alone could not solve the problem. A person could be well dressed and still become dangerously cold if exposed to severe weather for too long. That is why winter travel demanded caution. Before roads were developed, much of the frontier was connected by trails, rivers, and paths. Snow could transform a familiar route. A journey that took a few hours in mild weather might become exhausting or impossible after a heavy storm. Travelers therefore needed to think about distance differently. The question was not simply, how far away is the destination? It was also, can I reach it before the weather changes? That question could decide whether someone returned home safely. On the frontier, weather could arrive with little warning. A clear morning did not guarantee a clear afternoon. Wind could rise, temperatures could fall, snow could cover tracks. A traveler who became lost could face much greater danger than someone safely inside a house. For this reason, people often relied heavily on local knowledge. They learned the terrain. They noticed streams, hills, trees, fences, barns, and other landmarks. They watched the sky. They learned how certain winds felt and how quickly conditions could change. Indigenous peoples had developed extensive knowledge of winter travel and survival across many different North American environments long before European settlement. There was no single indigenous method, because indigenous nations lived in enormously different landscapes and had different traditions. In northern regions, knowledge of snow conditions, animal behavior, shelter, clothing, transportation, and food storage could be essential. European American settlers sometimes adopted indigenous technologies and practices, including snowshoes and forms of winter travel, although relationships between indigenous peoples and settlers varied greatly from cooperation to conflict. Snowshoes were particularly valuable in deep snow. A person wearing ordinary boots might sink deeply into soft powder. A snowshoe distributed body weight across a much larger surface. Instead of disappearing into the snow with every step, the traveler could remain closer to the surface. The design was simple in appearance, but remarkably effective. Wooden frames were shaped and joined with rawhide or other materials, creating a broad platform for the foot. Different forms existed for different conditions and regions. Walking with snowshoes required practice. The stride was not exactly the same as ordinary walking. Yet once learned, snowshoes could make winter travel across deep snow far more practical. And winter travel was not always optional. A family might need to reach a nearby settlement. Someone might need medical assistance. Animals might need supplies. Mail might have to be collected. Food might need to be purchased. Neighbors might need help. Even in difficult weather, life continued. This is one of the quieter truths about frontier winter. The season did not stop daily responsibilities. It changed them. A farmer could no longer spend every day working in an open field. Instead, winter brought other tasks. Tools needed repair. Animals needed feeding. Buildings needed maintenance. Clothing needed mending. Food needed to be managed carefully. Wood had to be brought inside. Water had to be carried. And if livestock were kept, the animals represented another major responsibility. A horse could be extremely valuable. Cattle, pigs, sheep, chickens, and other animals could provide food, labor, clothing materials, or income. But animals could not simply be forgotten once winter arrived. They needed shelter, feed, and protection. A barn or other livestock structure could reduce exposure to wind and snow. Hay and other feed had to be stored before winter became severe. For many farming communities, producing enough hay was one of the essential preparations for surviving the season. The same was true of food for people. The winter pantry was built gradually. Fresh vegetables became difficult to obtain in many places once the ground froze. So families relied on preservation. Meat could be salted, smoked, dried, or otherwise preserved depending on local customs, available technology, and period. Fruits could be dried. Vegetables could be stored in cool, dry places. Some foods could be preserved through pickling or fermentation. Root vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, turnips, and other crops could sometimes be kept for extended periods under suitable conditions. The methods varied, but the principle remained the same. Autumn was the time to prepare for scarcity. A full pantry gave a family choices. An empty pantry removed them. Imagine a household opening a storage area in the middle of January. There is no fresh produce aisle. There is no refrigerator humming quietly in the corner. There are jars, sacks, barrels, dried foods, preserved meats, roots, grains, and whatever else the family managed to store. Each item has a story behind it. Someone planted the crop. Someone harvested it. Someone cleaned it. Someone preserved it. Someone carried it into storage. Winter survival was therefore partly a story of accumulated labor. The work of spring and summer protected the family months later. Even bread depended on preparation. Grain had to be grown and harvested, then processed into flour. Depending on location, families might use local mills or grind grain themselves. A mill could become an important part of the surrounding community. The movement of grain and flour connected isolated farms with settlements and trading networks. This meant frontier families were rarely completely self-sufficient. The popular image of a lone settler surviving entirely from the wilderness is misleading. Many frontier households depended on neighbors, markets, merchants, mills, rivers, roads, and wider trade networks. Even a remote farm was connected to a larger world. That connection became especially important during winter. If a road disappeared under snow, a settlement could feel suddenly distant. A store might be several miles away. A mill might be farther. A neighbor could be the closest source of assistance. Community, therefore, became another form of winter protection. People helped each other with difficult work. A family might need assistance repairing a roof. A neighbor might need help after an illness. Someone could lose livestock. Another household might have extra food or fuel. Not every frontier community was peaceful or generous, of course. Poverty, conflict, isolation, and inequality were real. But cooperation was often practical. In a harsh environment, a useful neighbor could be as valuable as a strong fence. And there was another resource that could not be stored in a barn. Knowledge. Older residents knew things newcomers did not. They knew which low places flooded during thaw. They knew where winter winds were strongest. They knew which paths became dangerous after snow. They knew which streams froze reliably and which did not. They knew how much wood a particular house required. They knew when animals needed extra protection. New settlers had to learn. Sometimes they learned through careful observation, sometimes through advice, and sometimes through mistakes. The frontier could be unforgiving toward mistakes made at the wrong moment. A family that underestimated winter might discover the problem only after it was too late to correct. Perhaps the woodpile was too small. Perhaps the roof leaked. Perhaps the food supply had been calculated too narrowly. Perhaps an animal became sick. Perhaps the nearest neighbor was farther away than expected. Winter exposed weaknesses that summer could hide. This was particularly true on the Great Plains. The landscape could appear almost endless. There were fewer trees than in eastern forests, and the wind had fewer obstacles. A winter storm could therefore create an environment that felt completely different from the calm landscape of autumn. Settlers learned that a house needed to resist wind as well as cold. Some sod houses, dugouts, and other forms of shelter were used in treeless prairie regions. Sod houses were constructed from blocks of earth cut from the prairie. They could be laborious to build and had disadvantages, including moisture and insects, but the thick earthen walls could provide insulation and made use of a material that was readily available. A dugout could be built partly into the ground, reducing exposure to the open wind. These homes remind us that frontier architecture was often an experiment in adaptation. People did not always build the house they wanted. They built the house the landscape allowed, and sometimes the earth itself became part of the shelter. Farther north, winter presented different challenges. In the upper Midwest and northern plains, temperatures could become extremely low. Snow could become deep. Rivers and lakes could freeze. Yet frozen water could sometimes become a route rather than simply an obstacle. Sleds and sleighs could move more easily over snow than wheeled vehicles. Horses could pull loads across winter roads. In certain conditions, frozen rivers and lakes became temporary pathways, although traveling over ice was always dangerous because thickness could vary and hidden weak areas could exist. The winter landscape therefore had two sides. It closed some routes while opening others. A muddy road that was nearly impossible in autumn might become a firm winter track after freezing. A river that had been a barrier in summer could sometimes become a crossing. But ice demanded respect. People who lived in cold regions learned to look for signs of unsafe conditions. They did not have modern ice reports or standardized warning systems. They relied on observation, experience, and local knowledge. Still, experience could not eliminate danger. Every winter contained uncertainty, and that uncertainty shaped the rhythm of life. Evening came early. Once darkness settled over the landscape, the world outside became much less inviting. A person stepping beyond the light of the house might find the night almost completely black. There were no electric streetlights, no glowing windows stretching across a modern suburb, only moonlight, stars, lanterns, candles, and the faint glow from a doorway. Inside, the fireplace became a center of life. Its light moved across the walls. Wood cracked softly. Smoke might drift through the room if the chimney did not draw properly. The smell of burning wood mixed with the smell of cooking food, wool clothing, leather, and whatever herbs or materials were used inside the household. People gathered close because warmth was limited. Beds were often placed where they could benefit from the warmth of the house. Blankets mattered. So did the number of people sleeping in a room. A larger group could share body warmth, although sleeping arrangements varied widely according to household size, social class, culture, and available space. In some homes, several family members shared beds or sleeping spaces. Privacy, as we understand it today, was often limited. The goal was practicality. The night was not necessarily a time for complete silence. There might be the sound of wind against the walls, a horse shifting in the barn, a piece of firewood collapsing into the coals, someone coughing, a baby waking, a door opening briefly as someone checked the animals. Then the house would become quiet again. For a modern person, the silence might feel strange. For a frontier family, it was simply another winter night. And while people slept, the fire continued to lose its strength. That meant someone might have to rise early to rebuild it. The morning routine could begin before sunrise. Ashes were moved. Kindling was placed carefully. A flame appeared. Then larger pieces of wood. Warmth returned gradually. This repeated cycle was one of the hidden costs of living in a cold climate. Heat was never automatic. Someone had to make it. Someone had to maintain it. Someone had to gather the fuel that made it possible. The same was true of water. In freezing weather, obtaining water could become difficult. A nearby stream might be frozen. A pump could freeze. Snow could be melted, although doing so required fuel and produced less water than its volume might suggest. If a family depended on a well, keeping access to it could become an important part of winter work. Water was needed for drinking, cooking, cleaning, and animals. The frontier household therefore had a long list of small tasks that modern life often hides from us. Today, turning on a tap requires almost no thought. For a 19th century family, water might mean carrying a heavy bucket through cold air. Today, a thermostat quietly maintains a selected temperature. On the frontier, warmth depended on fuel and attention. Today, food can arrive from thousands of miles away. A frontier household might depend largely on what had been harvested, preserved, purchased, or traded before winter closed the roads. The difference is easy to underestimate. Winter survival was not usually one heroic act. It was thousands of ordinary decisions made correctly. A properly stacked woodpile, a sealed wall, a dry blanket, a stored sack of grain, a healthy horse, a repaired boot, a covered water source, a neighbor who could be called upon. Each small advantage mattered. And perhaps that is why frontier survival can feel surprisingly intimate when we look at it closely. It was not simply about fighting nature. It was about learning how to live within the limits of nature. People watched the seasons. They listened to the weather. They stored what they could. They repaired what they owned. They reused materials. They planned ahead. And they accepted that winter would change the shape of their days. As the morning slowly arrives, the light outside becomes brighter. The snow reflects a faint gray glow through the small windows. Inside, breakfast is being prepared. There may be porridge, bread, preserved meat, potatoes, dried fruit, or another simple meal, depending on the region and the household. The food is not necessarily abundant, but if preparations have gone well, there is enough. A family member opens the door briefly. Cold air enters. The fire pulls at the draft. Outside, the snow has settled deeper during the night. The animals need attention. The path to the barn must be cleared. And the day begins again. No one expects winter to become gentle. Instead, they have built their lives around its presence. That is how many frontier families endured. Not by defeating the cold, but by understanding it. And once we understand that, we can begin to see the frontier winter differently. It was not an empty season between harvest and spring. It was a season of work, caution, preservation, adaptation, and quiet endurance. Beyond the little house, the forest remains still. Across the prairie, the wind moves over the snow. Far away, another family is waking beside another fire. Their winter may look different. Their shelter may be different. Their food may be different. Their tools may be different. But the same basic hope exists inside their home. To stay warm tonight. To have enough food tomorrow. To keep the animals alive. To reach spring. And slowly, day after day, the season moves forward. The snow remains. The cold remains. But so do the people. And beneath the quiet surface of the winter landscape, their preparations continue. The preparations continue quietly, almost unnoticed beneath the white landscape. There is no single moment when a frontier family can say that winter has been defeated. Instead, each morning brings another small task, and each evening confirms whether yesterday's preparations were enough. As the days pass, the family becomes more familiar with the rhythm of the cold. The fire is built in much the same way. The animals are fed in much the same way. The stored food is measured, clothing is repaired, boots are dried, and outside, the snow slowly changes the shape of the world. A familiar path can disappear beneath a new snowfall. A fence can become almost invisible. The branches of trees may bend beneath the weight of snow. The landscape that was open and recognizable in autumn can become strangely quiet. For someone arriving from a warmer region, such a transformation could be unsettling. But people who lived through several winters learned that the land was still there. It simply required a different kind of attention. Picture yourself standing at the doorway of a small frontier home. The air outside is sharp enough to make breathing noticeable. Your clothing feels heavy. The ground gives slightly beneath your boots. There is a faint smell of smoke coming from the chimney above you. Beyond the house, the fields seem almost empty. Yet there is work everywhere. The barn needs checking. The wood needs bringing inside. The animals need water. The roof may need inspection. And somewhere beneath the snow, the family depends upon the crops and supplies that were placed there months earlier. Winter makes hidden things important. A cellar becomes valuable. A dry storage room becomes valuable. A properly covered stack of hay becomes valuable. A warm pair of socks becomes valuable. Even a simple piece of cloth can matter if it helps prevent cold air from reaching the skin. Frontier families often lived with far fewer possessions than modern households. But that did not mean every object was disposable. Clothing could be repaired again and again. A worn garment might be patched. A larger piece of fabric could be cut down for another use. Leather could be repaired. Wooden tools could be reshaped. Broken household objects could sometimes be turned into something useful. Winter encouraged careful use of materials because replacing an item could require a long journey or considerable expense. A missing button was not necessarily a reason to buy another shirt. It was a small repair waiting to be made. The same practical attitude appeared in footwear. Cold feet were not simply uncomfortable. If someone had to work outdoors for hours, wet or inadequate footwear could become dangerous. Boots and shoes needed to be kept as dry as possible. Wet clothing could lose much of its insulating ability, so when a person returned from outside, drying clothing near the fire could become part of the ordinary evening routine. But it had to be done carefully. Leather could become damaged by excessive heat. Clothing could scorch. The fire that protected a household could also cause accidents. This was another reality of frontier life. The same resources that provided safety could create danger. Fire warmed the house. Fire could also destroy it. A candle provided light. A candle could ignite dry material. A wood stove made cooking easier. A poorly managed stove or chimney could fill a room with smoke or create a serious fire hazard. That is why household knowledge mattered so much. People learned where to place objects. They learned to keep combustible materials away from flames. They watched chimneys. They maintained fireplaces. They understood that a house could not simply be warmed without attention. In the winter darkness, this knowledge became part of survival. The same careful thinking applied to food. A family could have plenty of food in October and still struggle in February if supplies were poorly managed. Preservation was therefore only the beginning. Food had to be rationed. Certain items might be used early. Others needed to be saved. Fresh meat could be limited. Stored grain might become increasingly important. Root vegetables could provide calories during months when gardens were dormant. Beans and other dried foods could be stored for long periods. The exact diet varied enormously from place to place. A wealthy household had different possibilities from a poor household. A farming family had different supplies from a trading family. A family near a river had different opportunities from one living far from reliable water. Still, many households depended on a mixture of preserved foods rather than one single source. This variety offered some protection against failure. If one crop was poor, another might help. If hunting produced less meat than expected, stored grain could become more important. If a family had access to livestock, milk, or eggs might provide additional food when conditions allowed. But winter could still create shortages. Crop failure, illness, economic hardship, isolation, and severe weather could combine. A bad winter did not affect everyone equally. People with more resources could purchase supplies. People with fewer resources had fewer choices. This is an important part of the story, because frontier life was never equally difficult for everyone. Some households had sturdy houses, large barns, plenty of animals, and well-stocked storage. Others lived in small structures with limited fuel and little food beyond what they had managed to preserve. For poor families, winter could be frighteningly close to the edge, and for newly arrived settlers, the first winter could be especially challenging. They might not yet understand the local climate. They might not know how much fuel was necessary. They might have underestimated the amount of food required. They might have built a house quickly without realizing how important insulation would become. The first winter could teach lessons that remained for years. Sometimes, those lessons came from neighbors. A newcomer might notice that an experienced family had built a particular type of shelter. They might see how carefully the older residents stacked firewood. They might learn that a certain route became dangerous after heavy snow. They might discover which food stored well. In this way, knowledge moved quietly through communities. There were no online tutorials. There was no instant search for advice. Someone had to demonstrate the method. Someone else had to watch. Then the knowledge was remembered. Children learned too. Frontier children were often expected to contribute to household work according to their age and circumstances. They might help gather small pieces of wood. They might carry water. They might feed chickens. They might help care for younger children. They might assist with food preparation or household repairs. Their winter experience was therefore not completely separate from adult life. From an early age, many children learned that warmth, food, and shelter required effort. They also learned the sounds of winter, the creaking of frozen wood, the crunch of snow beneath boots, the sudden silence after a storm, the whistle of wind through gaps in a wall, the soft movement of animals inside a barn. These sounds became part of the landscape. For a child growing up in such a place, winter was not simply a photograph of snow. It was a collection of familiar sensations. The smell of smoke on clothing, the cold feeling of a metal door latch, the warmth of a cup held between both hands, the sound of someone splitting wood outside, the feeling of returning indoors after a long walk. Small experiences like these helped define daily life. And then there were storms. A heavy winter storm could change everything within hours. Snow could block roads and cover trails. Strong winds could reduce visibility. Temperatures could fall rapidly. In some regions, blizzards were especially dangerous because travelers could become disoriented even when they were relatively close to home. For this reason, people often understood the wisdom of staying indoors when conditions became severe. A house might feel small on an ordinary day. During a blizzard, its walls could become a protective boundary. Inside, the family could wait. Outside, the landscape could become impossible to navigate. This was one reason supplies mattered so much. A household did not prepare for winter simply because it expected to go outside. It prepared because sometimes it could not go outside at all. Imagine the snow beginning before sunrise. At first, the flakes are light. They drift past the window. The wind is gentle. No one is particularly concerned. Then the snowfall becomes heavier. The sky turns white. The trees disappear behind moving snow. The road is no longer visible. A person might step toward the doorway, look outside, and decide to remain indoors. That decision could be the safest one available. Hours pass. The fire is fed. Food is prepared. The animals are checked if possible. The family listens. The storm continues. Inside, time becomes slower. Without modern entertainment, people found many ways to occupy the long winter evenings. There could be conversation, reading, where books were available, sewing, knitting, repairing tools, carving wood, writing letters, playing simple games, religious activities, storytelling, music. The exact activities depended on the household and community. But winter encouraged indoor work. A task that might be ignored during a busy summer could finally receive attention. A garment could be repaired. A tool could be sharpened. A piece of furniture could be fixed. The long evening was not necessarily empty. It was simply different. And sometimes, the quiet itself was valuable. After a day of physical work, people could sit near the fire while the storm moved outside. The flames gave off a gentle warmth. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke. Someone might speak quietly. Someone else might mend a sleeve. A child might fall asleep nearby. For a moment, the frontier could feel almost peaceful. But the peacefulness depended on preparation. Without food, fuel, and shelter, the same storm could become terrifying. This difference explains why the woodpile outside the house mattered so much. A stack of wood was not merely a stack of wood. It was time. Every log represented cutting, splitting, carrying, and storing. When the family placed another piece on the fire, they were using work completed months earlier. In that sense, winter was partly a conversation between the past and the present. The person who cut wood in August was helping the person sitting beside the fire in January. The person who harvested grain in summer was feeding the household in February. The person who repaired the roof in autumn was protecting the family during a winter storm. Preparation allowed different seasons to support one another. Summer work became winter safety. Autumn storage became spring survival. And winter itself became a period of maintenance. The animals were especially important in this cycle. A horse could provide transportation and labor. Oxen could help with heavy work. Cattle could provide meat and other resources. Sheep could provide wool. Chickens could provide eggs. Pigs could provide meat. Losing livestock during winter could therefore have consequences far beyond one animal. It could affect transportation, food, clothing, and future agricultural work. Farmers paid attention to animal condition. They provided shelter when needed. They stored feed. They watched for illness. In extremely cold weather, animals could require more energy simply to maintain body warmth. This meant that feed management was not just about quantity. Timing mattered too. A farmer had to think about how much feed was available and how long it needed to last. If too much was used early in winter, shortages could appear later. If animals were kept in poor conditions, they could weaken. The same careful calculation appeared everywhere. How much grain remains? How much hay? How much salt? How much wood? How much lamp oil? How much candle material? How much clothing is still usable? How long until spring? The last question was perhaps the most difficult. People did not have precise long-range forecasts. They could observe seasonal patterns, but unusual weather remained unpredictable. A winter could be mild. Another could be severe. A storm could arrive unexpectedly. The uncertainty meant that experienced families often prepared for more than the average winter might require. It was better to have extra fuel than to discover a shortage during a storm. It was better to have preserved food remaining than to finish everything too early. This principle extended beyond the household. Communities developed systems of trade and exchange that helped reduce isolation. A general store could provide items that could not easily be produced at home. Salt, iron tools, cloth, medicines, lamps, and other goods could enter frontier settlements through trade networks. In return, settlers might sell agricultural products, livestock, hides, timber, or other goods. These exchanges connected the frontier to distant economies. A remote-looking cabin might therefore contain an object manufactured hundreds of miles away. A metal tool might have traveled through several stages of trade, before reaching the person who used it. Winter did not completely separate the frontier from the wider world. It simply made those connections harder to maintain. When roads became difficult, rivers froze, and snow blocked trails, the distance between communities seemed larger. Mail could be delayed, deliveries could arrive late, travel could become dangerous. People had to accept that communication might slow down. A letter could take much longer to arrive than expected. A family waiting for news might have no way to know exactly when the message would come. That waiting was part of frontier life. So was the possibility that a traveler might not arrive. The winter landscape could create a strange sense of distance. A nearby settlement could feel extremely far away. The nearest neighbor might live only a few miles from the house, yet reaching them through deep snow could take considerable effort. This is why communities often formed around accessible routes, rivers, mills, churches, trading posts, and other shared centers. Where people lived influenced how easily they could survive winter. Geography mattered. A house sheltered behind trees could experience different wind conditions from one standing alone on an exposed plain. A farm near reliable water had different possibilities from one far from a stream. A settlement close to a road or trading center had different access to supplies from an isolated homestead. People gradually learned these differences. They chose locations with survival in mind. Sometimes they made mistakes. Sometimes the land proved less forgiving than expected. But over time, settlement patterns reflected experience. And through all of this, indigenous knowledge remained an important part of the larger history of North American winter survival. Long before European American settlement expanded across the continent, indigenous peoples had developed sophisticated ways of living in environments ranging from Arctic regions to deserts, forests, mountains, and plains. Their technologies included specialized clothing, shelters, food preservation, transportation, hunting methods, and seasonal movement. The exact practices differed greatly between nations. There was no single indigenous approach to winter. In some northern regions, snow could become a building material. In forested regions, knowledge of trees and animal habitats could support winter travel and hunting. On the plains, seasonal movement and knowledge of weather could be essential. In mountainous regions, terrain and snow behavior created different challenges. European settlers sometimes learned directly from indigenous neighbors, guides, traders, and communities. At other times, settlers attempted to impose unfamiliar methods on environments they did not yet understand. The results could be mixed. The broader lesson, however, remains clear. Survival knowledge in North America did not begin with the arrival of European settlers. It had deep roots stretching across thousands of years of human experience. The frontier settlers who survived difficult winters were often using a mixture of inherited traditions, local adaptations, and knowledge borrowed from the people who already understood the land. And the land itself continued to teach. A winter spent in one place could reveal what needed to change before the next. Perhaps the chimney needed improvement. Perhaps the barn needed better protection from wind. Perhaps more hay was required. Perhaps the family needed a larger food store. Perhaps the road to town was too exposed. Perhaps the house should be built closer to a source of fuel. Each winter became a lesson. Each spring offered a chance to make changes. Then summer arrived. The snow disappeared. The fields opened. The fire became less important. The family could spend more time outdoors. But somewhere in the back of everyone's mind was the knowledge that winter would return. So preparation began again. Wood would be cut. Fences would be repaired. Crops would be planted. Animals would be raised. Food would be preserved. Clothing would be mended. The cycle continued, and slowly a household became more experienced. The first winter might have been frightening. The second was more familiar. By the third, certain tasks could almost become automatic. The family knew when to begin storing food. They knew how much wood they needed. They knew how the house behaved in a storm. They knew where the snow accumulated. They knew which animals required more care. They knew how long supplies might last. Experience transformed uncertainty into routine. Not perfect safety, not comfort, but confidence. That confidence was one of the quiet strengths of frontier life. A person who understood the local winter was not simply enduring cold. They were reading a familiar environment. They knew when to go outside and when to stay indoors. They knew when a storm was becoming serious. They knew how to prepare the fire. They knew how to dress. They knew how to conserve supplies. They knew when to ask for help. And they understood that surviving winter was rarely an individual achievement. It was a household effort. Sometimes it was a community effort, and sometimes it depended upon knowledge passed down from people who had lived on the land long before the settlers arrived. Outside, the storm gradually begins to weaken. The wind is softer now. Snow still falls, but the air no longer moves with the same force. Inside the house, the fire has burned lower. Someone adds another piece of wood. The flames rise quietly. A kettle warms near the heat. The smell of smoke and food fills the room. For a little while, there is nothing urgent to do. The family can rest. Tomorrow there will be more work. The path will need clearing. The animals will need feeding. The roof may need checking. The snow will have to be moved away from doors and important paths. But tonight, the house is holding. The walls are standing. The food is stored. The fire is burning. And the people inside are safe. That simple feeling may have been one of the greatest comforts a frontier winter could offer. Not luxury. Not warmth in every corner. Just the knowledge that the shelter had done its job. As the evening grows quieter, the storm outside becomes a distant sound. The wind moves across the roof. Snow touches the window. The fire settles into glowing coals. And somewhere beyond the walls, the frontier disappears into darkness. Tomorrow, the landscape will look different again. But the people inside will wake, rebuild the fire, and continue. Because surviving brutal winters was not about one extraordinary night. It was about repeating the right ordinary things. Prepare before the cold, store before scarcity, repair before failure. Stay close when travel becomes dangerous. Use what the land provides. Learn from those who know it. And never assume that winter will forgive poor preparation. The season will continue for many weeks. But so will they. And with each quiet morning, each carefully carried log, each preserved meal, and each night spent beside the fire, they will move a little closer to spring. By the time the storm has passed, the world outside seems almost unfamiliar. The snow lies higher against the walls. The paths that were visible yesterday have disappeared. Branches that once reached toward the sky now bend beneath their white covering. For a moment, the frontier seems to have been erased. Yet inside the house, life continues. The fire is stirred. A pot is placed near the heat. Someone checks the stored food. Someone else looks toward the door and wonders how much snow has gathered against it. There is no need for alarm. The storm was expected to be difficult. The family had prepared for the possibility of being confined indoors. That preparation changes everything. A winter storm is still inconvenient. But inconvenience is very different from catastrophe. This quiet distinction lies at the heart of frontier survival. People did not always have the ability to stop a storm. They learned instead to make their lives less dependent on favorable weather. When the road disappeared, they had food inside. When the temperature fell, they had fuel. When the fields became useless beneath snow, they had stored supplies. When travel became dangerous, they could wait. Waiting was sometimes an important survival skill. In the modern world, waiting can feel like wasted time. On the frontier, waiting could be wise. A traveler who refused to wait for better conditions might become lost. A farmer who insisted on working outside during dangerous weather could become exhausted or injured. A family that used too much fuel early in a long storm could create a shortage later. Patience was practical, and winter demanded it. Imagine waking before sunrise after a night of heavy snow. The house is still dark. The fire has almost disappeared. You can feel the cold on your face as you sit up beneath the blankets. For a few moments, you remain still. Then you hear the soft movement of someone beginning the morning. Wood is brought toward the fireplace. Kindling catches. The first flame is small. It flickers against the darkness. Then it grows. The room slowly becomes visible again. This simple ritual might happen thousands of times across a lifetime. There is something almost timeless about it. Before electricity, before modern heating systems, before the convenience of automatic appliances, people began winter mornings by creating the conditions necessary for the day to continue. Heat came first, then water, then food, then the animals. The order could vary, but the logic was familiar. Survival needs had to be handled before comfort. And the first challenge after a major storm was often simply getting out of the house. Snow could accumulate against doors. A person might need to shovel or clear a path. Tools such as shovels were useful, but in earlier frontier settings, people also used whatever equipment they had available. The work could be tiring because snow becomes heavy when it is wet. A small path might be cleared first, then a route to the barn, then access to important supplies. If snow continued to fall, the work might have to be repeated. This could become one of winter's most frustrating rhythms. Clear the path. Snow falls. Clear it again. Yet the path mattered. A blocked doorway could become dangerous. Animals still needed care. Water still had to be carried. And in an emergency, people needed a way out. The roof required attention as well. Heavy snow could place considerable weight on a structure. Not every building was equally strong. A carefully built roof could handle winter conditions better than a temporary structure. In some places, snow was allowed to remain until it became necessary to remove it. In others, residents cleared it when accumulation became concerning. The exact practice depended on the building, climate, construction, and local experience. Again, knowledge mattered. A person who understood the structure knew what it could withstand. The frontier was filled with such practical judgments. How much snow is too much? How much wood remains? Is the animal healthy? Is the ice safe? Can the road be traveled? Should we leave today or wait? There were rarely simple answers. Experience provided guidance. But even experienced people could be surprised. One of the greatest difficulties of winter was uncertainty. The weather could remain mild for days and then change quickly. A warm spell could soften snow and create mud. A sudden freeze could make roads hard. A new storm could erase tracks. A thaw could weaken ice. Then another cold wave could return. The landscape was constantly changing. This affected travel more than almost anything else. Frontier roads were often seasonal in character. A route that was usable during one month could become difficult the next. In wooded regions, snow could cover fallen branches, holes, and uneven ground. On the plains, wind could blow snow across roads and create drifts. In mountainous areas, steep terrain added another layer of danger. People therefore planned journeys around conditions. The shortest route was not always the safest. A longer route following a known trail could be preferable to crossing unknown ground. A traveler might also carry supplies in case the journey took longer than expected. The basic principle was simple. Never assume the journey will go exactly as planned. That lesson remains familiar today. But on the frontier, the consequences of being wrong could be much greater. There were no rescue helicopters waiting nearby. There were no emergency vehicles that could arrive within minutes. A person who became stranded might have to solve the problem alone. This is why navigation skills mattered. People relied on landmarks, trail knowledge, compasses, and familiarity with the landscape. A traveler who knew the route could recognize small features that a stranger might overlook. A particular hill, a line of trees, a creek, a rock formation, a fence, a bend in a trail. These details could become anchors in a white landscape. Snow could make everything look similar. A familiar landmark could mean the difference between knowing where you were and becoming uncertain. And uncertainty was dangerous in severe cold. The human body loses heat when exposed to cold air, especially when clothing is wet or inadequate. Wind can increase heat loss from exposed skin. Physical exhaustion can make it harder to respond to danger. So frontier travelers often had to balance the need to reach a destination against the risks of continuing. There was wisdom in turning back. There was wisdom in postponing a journey. There was wisdom in recognizing that arriving tomorrow was better than never arriving at all. This practical caution extended to animal transportation. Horses were often essential to frontier movement, but they too faced winter conditions. A horse could pull a sleigh or carry a rider through snow, yet its strength was not unlimited. Animals required food and rest. Their hooves could be affected by ice and frozen ground. Their bodies could become stressed by long travel in severe conditions. Owners, therefore, had to care for the animal as carefully as they cared for their own equipment. A horse was not simply transportation. It was a living partner in the household economy. The loss of one could create enormous hardship. Sleds and sleighs offered advantages over wheeled vehicles in snowy conditions. The runners could glide across packed snow. A horse pulling a sleigh could move loads that would have been difficult to transport through deep snow with ordinary carts. In some northern communities, winter transportation became more efficient after snow arrived. This might seem surprising. The same snow that made walking difficult could make certain forms of transportation easier. Winter, therefore, did not simply make movement impossible. It changed the technology of movement. Snowshoes, sleds, sleighs, skis in some regions. These tools transformed the environment. They allowed people to work with winter rather than simply against it. Indigenous peoples across North America had developed many specialized forms of winter transportation long before European American settlement expanded. The knowledge behind these technologies reflected generations of observation. A snowshoe was not merely a strange wooden frame. Its shape, width, and flexibility were adapted to particular conditions. A sled was not merely a platform. Its runners had to interact with snow in useful ways. Different landscapes encouraged different solutions. European settlers sometimes adopted these technologies and adapted them to their own needs. The frontier was therefore not a place where one culture possessed all the answers. Knowledge moved. Technologies changed. Methods were borrowed, modified, and sometimes forgotten. Winter encouraged practical experimentation because poor design could quickly reveal itself. A coat that worked in mild weather might fail in extreme cold. A house that felt comfortable in autumn might become dangerously drafty in January. A storage system that worked for one crop might fail with another. People learned through observation. And because resources were limited, experimentation often meant modifying what already existed. A blanket could be layered. A wall could be sealed. A door could be reinforced. A window could be covered. A room could be arranged to concentrate heat. Furniture could be moved. Beds could be positioned differently. The house itself could become a tool for survival. One important advantage came from making the living space smaller. A large open room was difficult to heat. Smaller spaces required less energy to warm. This was one reason many frontier homes were modest in size. The goal was not necessarily to have a large interior. It was to have a manageable one. A fireplace or stove could provide heat to the main living area. Other rooms might remain colder. Family members naturally gathered closer to the warmest part of the house. This created a particular social atmosphere. People were physically close because warmth encouraged closeness. Winter evenings could therefore become periods of conversation. Stories could be shared. Memories could be discussed. Children could listen to adults. Neighbors could visit when conditions allowed. A winter gathering did not require elaborate entertainment. Human company was enough. The fire provided light. The walls provided shelter. The evenings stretched slowly toward bedtime, and when sleep came, the household once again relied on layers. Blankets, quilts, wool, fur, mattresses made from available materials. The sleeping space was arranged according to the resources of the household. Quilting deserves special attention because it combined practical warmth with household labor. Quilts could be made from layers of fabric and insulating material. Pieces of worn clothing or other textiles could sometimes be reused. A finished quilt represented many hours of sewing. It could be repaired. It could be passed through generations. In a cold house, a good quilt was not simply decorative. It was useful insulation. The same idea applied to curtains, rugs, and other textiles. They could help reduce drafts and make a room feel warmer. Even the arrangement of furniture could influence comfort. A bed placed away from a draft could be more pleasant than one near a poorly sealed window. A chair near the fire could become the preferred place to sit. People learned where warmth existed. They also learned where cold air entered. A person might notice a draft near a door long before anyone could measure the temperature. They could feel it against the skin. They could hear it. They might even see smoke or flame behave differently in moving air. These observations became practical information. The frontier household was therefore a place of constant environmental awareness. People noticed changes because they had to. And perhaps nowhere was this more important than in food storage. A good storage room needed to remain cool, but not freeze everything. Root cellars and similar spaces could take advantage of the relatively stable temperatures underground. They were useful for storing vegetables and other foods. The earth itself provided insulation. A well-managed cellar could help extend the life of crops long after harvest. But storage required care. Moisture could cause rot. Pests could damage food. Poor ventilation could create problems. Different foods needed different conditions. A family, therefore, had to understand not only what to store, but where to store it. Food preservation was a form of knowledge. Salted meat behaved differently from dried meat. Dried beans behaved differently from fresh vegetables. Apples could be stored under suitable conditions. Potatoes needed protection from excessive freezing. The goal was to slow natural decay until the food was needed. This mattered because winter could last for months. The gap between harvest and the next growing season could be long. A household had to bridge that gap. This is one of the most important ways to understand frontier survival. People were constantly building bridges between seasons. The harvest built the winter pantry. The winter pantry carried the family toward spring. The surviving livestock provided resources for the coming year. The tools repaired during winter supported spring planting. The clothing mended in winter protected people during future work. Nothing existed in isolation. Every season depended upon the work of another. As the winter progressed, food choices could become simpler. Fresh variety was limited. Preserved food became familiar. The same ingredients might appear repeatedly in meals. This does not mean everyone ate the same food, because diets varied greatly by region, wealth, culture, and access. But preservation shaped the possibilities. A meal could be built around what remained. A pot of beans, bread, stored roots, salted or smoked meat, dried fruit, grain porridge. The food might be plain, yet warm food itself was valuable during winter. A hot meal could provide both energy and comfort. The smell of cooking could make a cold room feel more welcoming. Steam might rise from a pot. Wood smoke could mingle with the scent of grain or meat. A person returning from outside could feel warmth on the face before even sitting down. These small sensory experiences were part of winter life. They were not luxuries. They were ordinary pleasures. And ordinary pleasures mattered. Frontier life is sometimes imagined only through hardship, but people still laughed. They still celebrated. They still visited friends. They still cared for children. They still listened to music. They still enjoyed good meals when they could. They still found beauty in snow-covered trees and clear winter skies. Hardship did not eliminate ordinary human emotions. In fact, difficult conditions could make small comforts more meaningful. A dry pair of socks, a warm bed, a full bowl, a quiet fire, a familiar voice, a safe roof. These could be enough. And then there were the nights when the sky cleared. After a storm, the stars might appear with remarkable clarity. Without modern city lights, the night sky could be far darker than what most people see today. The cold would be intense. The snow might reflect moonlight. A person stepping outside briefly could see the landscape shining faintly beneath the sky. The silence might be broken only by distant animals or the sound of footsteps. For a moment, the frontier could seem peaceful rather than harsh. The same cold that threatened the body could also create extraordinary stillness. But no one living there could afford to forget its power. A beautiful winter night could become dangerous if a person remained outside too long. So people returned to shelter. They closed the door. The latch clicked into place. The fire waited inside. The warmth returned. This movement between outside and inside was repeated throughout the season. It was almost like breathing. Out into the cold, back into warmth, out for work, back for rest, out to gather, back to preserve, out to care for animals, back to the fire. Winter shaped the rhythm of every day, and gradually the season became a test of endurance. Not endurance in the dramatic sense. There was rarely a single moment of heroic action. Instead, there was repetition. The same careful tasks, the same precautions, the same attention to supplies, the same awareness of weather. This repetition could be tiring. But repetition also created skill. A person who had split wood for years became efficient. A person who had traveled in snow for years understood how to move. A person who had cared for livestock through many winters learned what signs to watch. A person who had preserved food for years understood which methods worked best. Skill reduced effort. Experience reduced uncertainty. And knowledge became one of the most valuable resources a frontier family possessed. Still, no amount of knowledge could guarantee safety. Disease remained a threat. Injury remained a threat. Food shortages remained possible. Fires could destroy homes. Livestock could die. Severe storms could isolate communities. Some winters were simply harder than others. And when hardship became severe, people depended on one another. Neighbors might share food. Someone might lend a horse. Another person might help repair a building. A family might provide temporary shelter. Community networks were not perfect, but they could make survival possible when individual resources were insufficient. This was particularly important for isolated households. A family living far from town might have little access to professional services. A serious illness could become a major crisis. A broken wagon wheel might leave them without transportation. A failed harvest could create months of difficulty. In such circumstances, relationships mattered. The frontier was not merely a collection of isolated cabins. It was also a network of people who depended upon one another to varying degrees. Churches, trading posts, schools, mills, stores, and neighboring farms could become centers of social life. Winter did not erase these connections. It sometimes made them more visible. When travel became difficult, people understood exactly how much they depended upon the nearest community. The winter landscape could make distance feel physical. A few miles of snow-covered road could represent hours of difficult travel. A frozen river could become both bridge and danger. A mountain pass could close completely. A settlement might wait days for a traveler. These delays could shape decisions. Families learned not to depend on supplies arriving at the exact moment they were needed. They stored extra when possible. They planned for interruption. This habit of planning for uncertainty was perhaps one of the most important frontier skills, and it leads us back to the beginning. The fire, the food, the shelter, the clothing, the animals, the community. Each was part of the same system. Remove one piece, and the others became more important. If the house was poorly insulated, more fuel was needed. If fuel was scarce, better insulation became more important. If food storage was limited, access to a trading post became more important. If travel was dangerous, stored supplies became more important. Everything was connected. The frontier family survived not because one technology solved winter, but because many small solutions worked together. That is what makes the story so interesting. A cabin wall, a quilt, a pair of snowshoes, a stack of hay, a cellar filled with roots, a sled waiting near the barn, a repaired coat hanging beside the fire. Each object seems ordinary. Together, they formed a system of survival. Outside, the snow begins to fall again. Not heavily this time. Just a few quiet flakes moving through the evening air. The family has finished its work. The animals are settled. The food has been prepared. The fire is steady. Someone closes the shutters. The room becomes warmer and darker. The day has passed. Another winter day survived. Tomorrow will bring more snow, more cold, and more work. But tomorrow will also bring another morning, another fire, another meal, another opportunity to continue. And somewhere beyond the walls, beneath the snow and frozen ground, the coming spring is already waiting. It is still far away. The family cannot see it, but they know it will come. Until then, they will keep doing what generations of frontier people learned to do. They will conserve. They will repair. They will wait. They will adapt. And quietly, patiently, they will live through the winter. The winter continues, but by now the family has settled into its rhythm. The first heavy storms have passed. The excitement of the first snow is gone. What remains is the long middle of winter, when the days can seem almost identical. Morning arrives slowly. The fire is rebuilt. Water is brought inside. Animals are fed. Breakfast is prepared. Then the ordinary work of the day begins. This was perhaps the most demanding part of winter. Not the single worst storm, but the long stretch of cold days that followed one another without much change. The frontier family had to maintain its supplies for weeks and sometimes months. A mistake made in December might not become obvious until February. A food shortage could appear gradually. A woodpile could become smaller every day. A pair of boots might slowly wear through. A roof might develop a leak. A horse might lose strength. Winter survival required attention not only to immediate problems, but to problems that had not yet appeared. Imagine standing beside the woodpile on a pale afternoon. The pile is smaller than it was a few weeks earlier. Each log has already been counted in the household's mind. There is no need for anyone to say the numbers aloud. People can see it. They know that every piece burned today will not be available tomorrow. This awareness encouraged careful use of fuel. The largest pieces might be saved for the coldest nights. Smaller pieces could be used when less heat was required. Kindling had to be kept dry. Wood that became wet could still burn under the right conditions, but starting and maintaining a fire was easier with properly seasoned fuel. The quality of firewood mattered too. Different woods burned differently. Some provided longer-lasting heat. Others ignited more easily. People with experience learned which local trees were useful for which purposes. This knowledge could vary by region because the forests themselves varied. In some areas, hardwoods were abundant. In others, softwoods were more common. The availability of timber influenced both building and heating. Where forests were plentiful, people could use wood extensively. Where trees were scarce, every piece of fuel became more precious. On the open plains, settlers sometimes had to search for alternative fuels. Dried animal dung could be collected and burned. Prairie grasses could sometimes be used in certain ways. In places where wood was available only at a distance, fuel gathering could become a serious part of winter preparation. This reminds us that the famous frontier cabin surrounded by endless forests represents only one version of frontier life. Many settlers lived in environments where trees were limited. The Great Plains could be particularly challenging. A family arriving there might expect the land to provide everything they needed, only to discover that the lack of timber changed the entire calculation. Building materials were different. Heating was different. Fencing was different. Even the appearance of the settlement was different. The landscape demanded new solutions. Sod became important in some regions. Earth could be shaped into walls. A partially underground home could provide protection from wind. A thick layer of earth could slow temperature changes. These homes were not necessarily comfortable by modern standards. They could be damp. They could be dark. They could attract insects. They could be difficult to expand. But they demonstrated a simple principle. When one resource was missing, people searched for another. Frontier survival was often a matter of substitution. If there was little timber, use earth. If roads were buried, use sleds. If fresh vegetables were unavailable, preserve roots. If a store was too far away, repair what you already owned. If fuel was scarce, conserve heat. This ability to adapt was more important than having one perfect technology. And adaptation often began with clothing. Winter clothing had to protect the body while allowing people to work. A farmer could not remain indoors all winter. Animals still needed care. Wood still had to be moved. Water still had to be carried. Snow still had to be cleared. So clothing needed to provide warmth without making ordinary movement impossible. Layers helped. A person could wear several garments rather than relying on one very thick layer. Wool was valuable. Fur could be useful. Leather offered protection against wind and rough conditions. Mittens could be warmer than gloves because the fingers remained together and could share warmth. Hats and other head coverings helped protect against heat loss and cold exposure. But clothing was only effective when it remained reasonably dry. This made wet snow particularly troublesome. A person returning from outside might have snow melting into their clothing. If that clothing was not dried properly, the next trip outside could begin with garments that were already damp. That could become uncomfortable and potentially dangerous. So the household developed places where clothing could dry. Near the fire, beside a stove, over a chair, on a line. The exact arrangement varied, but the idea was universal. Warmth had to be protected. Even bedding needed attention. Blankets could be aired when weather permitted. Mattresses could be adjusted. Quilts could be repaired. Sleeping areas could be kept away from drafts. People did not necessarily sleep in a uniformly warm room. Instead, they created small zones of comfort. A bed beneath several blankets could be warmer than the surrounding air. Several people sharing a sleeping space could reduce heat loss. The house became a collection of warmer and colder places. The family knew which was which. Children might learn quickly not to stand near a particular window. Someone might prefer a chair close to the stove. An older person might be given the warmest sleeping position. These small decisions reveal something important about frontier households. Survival was also social. People cared for one another. A child was not expected to solve the winter alone. An elderly family member might need extra warmth. Someone who became sick might require more fuel and attention. A person injured while working outside could suddenly become dependent on others. In a household with limited resources, illness could create a difficult chain of consequences. One person unable to work meant another person had to do more. If the injured person usually chopped wood, someone else had to take over. If they normally cared for animals, that responsibility shifted. If they prepared food, another household member had to learn or help. The family had to adjust. Winter made such changes more difficult because every task was already demanding. This is one reason practical skills were widely valued. A person who could repair a tool was useful. A person who could sew was useful. A person who understood animals was useful. A person who knew how to preserve food was useful. A person who could navigate snow was useful. Knowledge had economic value because replacing skilled work could be difficult. This was true for women as well as men, although the division of labor varied considerably by household, community, culture, and period. Women often carried major responsibilities for food preservation, clothing production, childcare, household management, and other work. Men often performed tasks such as logging, plowing, building, and animal work, but the boundaries were not universal. People adapted to circumstances. If someone was sick or absent, others took over necessary work. On the frontier, survival could be more important than maintaining a perfect division of tasks. Everyone's labor mattered, and the workload could be enormous. A winter day might contain many small jobs. None seemed extraordinary by itself. Together, they filled the day. Carry water, feed animals, bring in wood, prepare food, repair clothing, clean tools, check the roof, clear snow, look after children, preserve what remains, prepare for tomorrow. The repetition could become tiring, yet repetition was also comforting. Once a household established a routine, winter became more predictable. The same movements happened each day. The same places were used. The same tools were handled. The same meals appeared. Routine reduced the mental burden of constantly deciding what to do next. And when the weather was harsh, routine provided stability. This stability extended to animals. Livestock often followed daily patterns. A farmer knew when animals were hungry. A horse recognized feeding times. Chickens gathered in familiar places. Cattle moved toward shelter. These routines helped the household notice when something was wrong. An animal behaving differently could be a sign of illness or injury. Winter made early attention important. An unhealthy animal could lose weight quickly. A weak horse could become difficult to use. A sick cow could reduce a family's food supply. Farmers therefore watched their animals closely. They also had to think about ventilation. A barn that was completely sealed could become unhealthy. Animals needed protection from severe weather, but air still needed to move. Too much moisture could create problems. Again, the solution was balance. Warm enough, dry enough, protected enough, but not completely closed. Frontier life was full of these small balances. The house needed ventilation without excessive drafts. The cellar needed cool conditions without damaging moisture. The barn needed shelter without becoming unhealthy. Clothing needed warmth without becoming impossible to work in. Food needed preservation without spoiling. Travel needed speed without unnecessary risk. Survival was rarely about choosing one extreme. It was about finding a workable middle. This was particularly important when winter became unexpectedly mild. A warm spell could tempt people to travel. Snow might begin to melt. Roads could become muddy. Ice could weaken. Then temperatures could fall again. The landscape could become more dangerous, precisely because it seemed safer. Experienced people understood that winter was not always a steady state. It could shift quickly. A frozen stream could become open water. A solid path could become mud. A thaw could loosen a snowbank. A sudden freeze could turn wet surfaces into ice. People watched these transitions carefully. The timing of a journey mattered. A person leaving in the morning might face completely different conditions by afternoon. That uncertainty encouraged caution, and winter travel was sometimes essential for reasons that could not be postponed. Medical emergencies were especially serious. Before modern medicine and transportation, reaching a doctor could require a long journey. A person suffering from severe illness might have to be transported over rough roads or deep snow. If a physician lived many miles away, winter could make the journey extremely difficult. Communities therefore relied heavily on local knowledge and whatever medical resources were available nearby. Home remedies were common, though their effectiveness varied greatly. People used herbs, traditional preparations, and practical care. Some treatments were helpful, others were ineffective or harmful. Modern medicine has changed the situation dramatically, but frontier families had to work within the knowledge available to them. They learned from parents, neighbors, midwives, physicians when accessible, and traditional practices. Winter illness could be especially serious because cold conditions made travel difficult, and indoor living increased the amount of time people spent close together. Respiratory illnesses could spread. Poor ventilation could worsen indoor air quality. Smoke from fireplaces and stoves could irritate the lungs. Yet the solution was not always obvious. Opening windows in severe cold could make the house uncomfortable. Keeping everything closed could create other problems. Again, families balanced competing needs. The winter house was therefore not simply warm. It was a controlled environment, built with limited technology. People manipulated doors, shutters, curtains, fireplaces, stoves, bedding, and clothing to create a livable space. The technology was simple. The knowledge was not. And knowledge accumulated over generations. Some of it was written in household manuals, agricultural guides, newspapers, letters, diaries, and other records. Some was passed orally. Much was learned by watching. A child could see how an adult stacked wood. A young person could learn how to harness a horse. Someone could learn how to identify suitable firewood. Another person could learn how to preserve meat. The knowledge became ordinary because it was repeated. It was not necessarily considered special. But to a modern observer, some of these skills can seem remarkably complex. The frontier was a place where ordinary people often had to know how many systems worked. They needed basic understanding of weather, basic understanding of animals, basic understanding of agriculture, basic understanding of construction, basic understanding of food preservation, basic understanding of tools, basic understanding of navigation. No single person necessarily mastered all of these. But a household or community could contain many overlapping skills. This created resilience. If one person knew how to repair a wagon and another knew how to preserve meat, the community benefited from both. Winter made cooperation practical. And cooperation could sometimes extend across cultural boundaries. Frontier history involved complex relationships among settlers, indigenous peoples, traders, enslaved and free African Americans, immigrants, and many other communities. Experiences differed enormously by place and period. For some people, frontier settlement represented opportunity. For others, it meant displacement, violence, loss of land, or forced movement. Any story of frontier survival must therefore avoid treating the frontier as an empty wilderness. The land was already inhabited. Indigenous nations had their own homes, communities, economies, and seasonal systems. European American expansion transformed these landscapes, often through treaties that were later broken, warfare, forced removals, and other forms of dispossession. Winter survival methods existed within this much larger and more complicated history. Indigenous knowledge contributed to many aspects of life in North America, including winter transportation, food gathering, clothing, shelter, and environmental understanding. But the relationship was not simply one of peaceful exchange. It depended on the particular people, place, and period. Remembering this complexity makes the story more accurate. It also helps us understand why knowledge of the land was so valuable. The people who had lived in a region for generations often understood details that newcomers had not yet learned. Where the snow drifted, which animals remained active during winter, which plants could be found beneath snow, which routes were safest, how to move across frozen landscapes, how to construct shelters suited to local conditions. This knowledge could mean the difference between struggling and adapting. For settlers who were willing and able to learn, local knowledge could become a powerful resource. For others, failure to understand the environment could have serious consequences. The land did not adjust itself to newcomers. Newcomers had to adjust to the land, and winter made that lesson particularly clear. On the frontier, there was no guarantee that the methods that worked in one region would work in another. A house designed for a wooded eastern environment might not be ideal on an exposed prairie. A type of clothing suitable for wet coastal conditions might not perform the same way in dry, bitter cold. A route that worked in summer could become dangerous in winter. A crop that grew well in one place might fail in another. Adaptation had to be local. This is why frontier history contains so many different forms of shelter: log cabins, frame houses, stone structures, sod houses, dugouts, earth-covered buildings. The design depended on available materials, climate, wealth, technology, and local tradition. A wealthy settler could order milled lumber. A poor family might build with whatever could be gathered nearby. A community with a sawmill had different possibilities from one without one. Winter exposed the quality of those choices. A poorly sealed frame house could be extremely cold. A thick-walled structure might retain heat more effectively. A small house could be easier to warm than a large one. A chimney could improve ventilation and allow controlled fire. But every design had disadvantages. Smoke could be a problem. Fire could be a danger. Windows could leak cold. Roofs could fail. Walls could settle. The perfect frontier house did not exist. There were only better and worse solutions for particular circumstances, and families learned which solutions worked. They might add insulation. They might seal gaps. They might build an addition. They might move a stove. They might change the placement of beds. They might repair the chimney. The house could evolve. It was not necessarily finished the day it was built. A frontier home was often a long-term project. Each season revealed another improvement. Each winter tested the latest changes. By spring, the family could see what needed to be repaired. Then, summer provided the opportunity. This cycle of testing and improvement is one of the quiet themes running through frontier life. Winter was a teacher. Sometimes an unforgiving one. But the lessons were remembered. A family that lost food to moisture would store it differently next year. A roof damaged by snow would be strengthened. A traveler who became lost would remember the conditions. A farmer who ran short of hay would prepare more. A household that burned too much wood early in the season would manage the fire differently next winter. Mistakes became knowledge. Knowledge became preparation. Preparation became survival. And then there were the emotional challenges. Long winters could feel isolating. Days were short. Travel was limited. People could spend many hours inside the same small rooms. For families living far from towns, social contact could become infrequent. A neighbor might be too far away to visit regularly. A letter might take weeks to arrive. The landscape outside could remain unchanged for days. This monotony could affect people's mood. Yet people also developed ways to make winter meaningful. Religious gatherings, social visits, shared meals, music, reading, storytelling, crafts, and household projects gave structure to long evenings. Winter did not have to be empty. It simply required different forms of activity. For some communities, winter was also a season when certain kinds of work became easier. With fields dormant, there could be time for woodworking, textile work, tool repair, butchering, or other activities. In logging regions, winter conditions could sometimes make moving timber easier because frozen ground reduced mud and snow could assist certain forms of transport. Again, winter was not universally an enemy. It created problems, but it also created opportunities. The key was understanding which was which. A snowy landscape could be beautiful. It could also be dangerous. Frozen ground could make transportation easier. It could also cause falls. Ice could provide a crossing. It could also break. Cold could preserve certain foods. It could also threaten people and animals. Winter was never one thing. It was a collection of conditions. People learned to work with those conditions. As evening returns, the family gathers again. The outside temperature has dropped. The sky is clear. The snow reflects the faint light from the moon. Inside, the fire gives a soft glow. A pot sits near the heat. Someone folds a blanket. Another person checks the door. The animals are quiet. The day has been long, but the household has completed its work. There is something reassuring about the repetition. Yesterday was difficult. Today was difficult. Tomorrow will probably be difficult. But the family knows what to do. They know how to build the fire. They know how to prepare the food. They know where the animals are. They know where the blankets are. They know how much wood remains. They know how to wait. That last skill may be the most important. Winter cannot be hurried. No amount of effort can make February become April. A person can only continue through it, one morning at a time, one meal at a time, one fire at a time. And slowly, without anyone noticing at first, the season begins to change. The days become slightly longer. The sun remains above the horizon a little later. The snow begins to soften at the edges. Water drips from the roof during the warmest part of the afternoon. At night, the cold returns. Winter is not finished, but the balance has begun to shift. The family notices. Spring is still distant. Yet the possibility of spring is no longer abstract. It can be felt. The wood pile is smaller now. The food stores are lower. The animals have survived another difficult stretch. The house is held. The people have held. And the preparations made months ago have carried them this far. There is still more winter ahead. But the end is approaching. Outside, a single drop of melted snow falls from the roof. It touches the frozen ground and disappears. Inside, the fire continues to glow. The family settles down for another night. The cold remains beyond the walls. But now there is a quiet understanding that the season is slowly loosening its grip. And tomorrow, when the morning light returns, they will rise once again. They will open the door. They will feel the cold. They will look across the snow, and they will keep going. And so, after all the long nights, the frozen roads, and the quiet struggle against the cold, winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the American frontier. The snow that had once covered the fields began to soften beneath the returning sunlight. Thin streams of water appeared beside the cabins. Smoke still rose from chimneys in the early morning, but the fires no longer felt quite so urgent. For the people who had lived through the winter, survival had never depended on one single trick. It had been a collection of small decisions. Where to build a cabin, how to stack firewood, how to protect food from freezing, how to dress in layers, when to travel and when to stay home, when to trust a familiar trail and when to turn back. These choices might seem ordinary now, but on the frontier, an ordinary mistake could become a serious danger when temperatures fell and snow covered the landscape. Imagine standing outside one of those small frontier homes on a winter morning. The world around you is quiet. There are no engines starting in the distance, no electric lights glowing through windows, no weather app warning you about the temperature. There is only the pale morning sky, the frozen ground, and perhaps the faint sound of an axe striking wood somewhere nearby. Inside the house, someone is already awake. The fire has burned low during the night. A person carefully adds another piece of wood. Someone else checks the stored food. Another person looks toward the door, wondering whether the weather has improved enough for a journey. Life continues. Not because winter has become easy, but because people have learned how to live with it. This is perhaps the most important lesson from the old frontier winters. People did not defeat winter. They adapted to it. They watched the sky. They learned the land. They respected distance. They stored supplies before they were needed. And they understood something that modern life can sometimes make easy to forget. Survival often depends less on strength than on preparation. A warm coat helped. A good fire helped. A sturdy cabin helped. But knowing when to use each of them mattered just as much. The frontier was not a place where every person was constantly fighting for survival. Much of daily life was surprisingly ordinary. People cooked meals, repaired tools, cared for animals, visited neighbors, worked, rested, and raised children. Yet winter changed the rhythm of everything. A trip that might take an hour in summer could become dangerous in deep snow. A broken wagon wheel could become a serious problem. A shortage of firewood could turn into an emergency. A storm arriving earlier than expected could separate a traveler from home. And so, winter encouraged a particular kind of patience. People learned not to waste what they had. They repaired clothing instead of simply replacing it. They saved food carefully. They reused materials. They planned ahead. And they developed an intimate knowledge of their surroundings. A hill was not merely a hill. It might shelter a road from the wind. A grove of trees was not merely beautiful. It might provide fuel. A creek was not simply a source of water. In winter, it could become an obstacle hidden beneath ice and snow. The landscape itself became part of the knowledge required for survival. Native American communities had developed sophisticated winter adaptations long before European settlers arrived on the continent. Different nations lived in vastly different environments, and their methods varied accordingly. Clothing, housing, hunting practices, food storage, transportation, and seasonal movement were shaped by local conditions and generations of accumulated knowledge. European settlers also adapted, often borrowing techniques, materials, foods, routes, and knowledge from indigenous peoples, while developing their own practices. The frontier was therefore not simply a story of people confronting an unfamiliar wilderness with no knowledge at all. It was a landscape already understood by many indigenous communities, and newcomers gradually learned, sometimes through cooperation, sometimes through observation, and sometimes through painful mistakes, that surviving there required respecting the environment. As the years passed, settlements grew, roads improved, railroads eventually crossed enormous distances. Stores carried goods that once had to be produced at home. Heating systems became more efficient, communication became faster, and the old winter hardships gradually changed. But the memory of those winters remained. A cabin with thick walls, a stack of wood beside the door, a pantry filled before the first snow, a pair of boots drying beside a stove. These objects tell a quiet story. They remind us that technology was not the only thing that kept people alive. Knowledge mattered, habits mattered, community mattered. A neighbor who arrived with food could matter. Someone who knew the safest trail could matter. A family that had prepared early could endure a storm that would overwhelm an unprepared household. And perhaps that is why the old frontier winter is worth remembering. Not because every story was heroic. Most were not. Most survival was quiet. It was someone bringing in another armful of wood, someone mending a blanket, someone checking the animals before bed, someone refusing to leave the cabin during a dangerous storm, someone waking in the middle of the night to make sure the fire was still burning. No audience saw these moments. No historian could record every one. But these small actions were the foundation of survival. Now imagine that the last snow of the season is disappearing. The fields are beginning to show through. The air is still cold, but it no longer has the same sharpness. Birds return. Water moves again beneath the ice. The road that seemed endless during January becomes visible once more. People step outside. They stretch their legs. They look across the land. Another winter has passed. For those who lived through it, spring was more than a change in weather. It meant that travel would become easier. Food would become more available. Work would move outdoors again. And the landscape that had seemed closed for months would slowly open. There would be new planting, new journeys, new repairs, new plans, and eventually another winter. Because frontier life was a cycle. Prepare, endure, recover. Prepare again. The people who survived were not necessarily the strongest. They were often the ones who understood the rhythm of the place where they lived. They knew that winter could not be commanded. It could only be anticipated. And perhaps, centuries later, that remains one of the most useful things we can take from their experience. When conditions become difficult, we often look for one dramatic solution. But history rarely works that way. Sometimes survival is built from dozens of simple preparations. A little more wood, a little more food, a warmer layer, a safer route, a decision to wait, a decision to turn back, a willingness to listen to someone who knows the land. Small choices, repeated again and again. That was the quiet technology of survival on the frontier. And when the night finally comes, imagine one last cabin standing beneath a winter sky. Inside, the fire is low but steady. The walls hold back the wind. A blanket covers the sleeping family. Outside, snow rests silently against the fence. The animals are sheltered. The supplies have been stored. The doors are closed. There is nothing dramatic happening. And that is exactly the point. For the people inside, a peaceful night was itself a kind of victory. They had prepared. They had endured. They had made it through another day. And as the fire slowly fades into glowing embers, the frontier becomes quiet again. The wind moves across the snow. The trees stand dark against the sky. And somewhere beyond the cabin, beneath the frozen ground, spring is already waiting. The long winter will end. It always does. And for a little while, the people of the frontier can rest, because they have learned how to live with the cold. And they have learned that sometimes surviving the harshest season simply means knowing how to make one more night feel like home.